A woman lies dead in her home, her husband is convicted, then freed, but the real killer was never found. On the evening of January 20, 1931, William Wallace, an insurance agent, returned to his modest home in Liverpool's Anfield district. What he found would become one of England's most infamous unsolved murders. His wife Julia lay dead in the front room, her skull crushed by brutal blows from a heavy instrument. The room was in chaos, furniture overturned, drawers ransacked, yet the doors and windows showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing of obvious value was missing. A woman lay murdered in her own home, and the only person who could account for their whereabouts during those crucial hours was the one person the police suspected most, her husband. The night of January 20th, William Wallace claimed he was nowhere near home. He said he'd received a telephone call the day before from a man named R.M. Qualtrough, a potential client who wanted to discuss insurance business. Wallace spent that evening traveling across Liverpool by tram and on foot, searching for Qualtrough's address, a place that didn't exist. He was hunting a ghost. But here's where the timeline becomes the prosecution's smoking gun. According to their theory, Wallace never left home at all. They argued he fabricated the entire Qualtrough story as an alibi. If that were true, he had exactly 18 minutes, the gap between when neighbors last saw him leave and when he was spotted returning, to bludgeon his wife to death with a fire iron or poker, clean the blood from his hands and clothes, restore the room to some semblance of order, and compose himself enough to appear shocked when he raised the alarm. 18 minutes to commit and conceal a brutal murder. Even the prosecution's own witnesses struggled with this math. The sheer logistics seemed absurd. Yet the jury convicted him anyway, swayed more by suspicion and Wallace's cold demeanor than by physical evidence. The timeline was impossible, but they believed he'd done it anyway. The jury took just 1 hour to find William Wallace guilty of murder. The evidence against him was entirely circumstantial, no weapon was ever recovered, no witness placed him at the scene, and no bloodstains were found on his clothing. What convicted him was suspicion. The jury simply could not believe his story about the mysterious Qualtrough call and the failed meeting. They decided he was lying, that he had killed his wife in a calculated rage, and that the whole elaborate alibi was a desperate invention. But the appeals court saw something different. In 1931, the judges reviewed the case and concluded that the evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The timeline remained impossibly tight. The lack of physical evidence was glaring. Most crucially, the appeals court ruled that circumstantial evidence alone, without corroboration of the critical facts, could not sustain a murder conviction. Wallace's conviction was overturned. Yet here lies the true tragedy of the case. Wallace was never retried. He walked free, but he was never fully exonerated. The real killer was never found, never named, never prosecuted. For over 90 years, Julia Wallace's murder has remained unsolved. A man was convicted on suspicion, then freed on doubt, while the actual murderer slipped into the shadows of history, their identity lost forever. The Wallace case did something remarkable. It escaped the courtroom and invaded the minds of the greatest crime writers of the 20th century. Dorothy L. Sayers, creator of Lord Peter Wimsey, was so captivated by the logical impossibility of the crime that she wrote extensively about it, treating the case as a puzzle that refused to yield a clean solution. P.D. James, decades later, returned to the same ground, fascinated by how a jury could convict on suspicion alone when the mathematics of murder simply did not work. These weren't casual observations. Sayers and James saw in Julia Wallace's death something that transcended a single historical crime. They saw a perfect storm of circumstantial evidence, reasonable doubt, and the terrifying possibility that an innocent man had been punished for a murder he did not commit. The case became a kind of literary ghost, haunting detective fiction itself. Crime writers used it as a touchstone, a reminder that real murder is messier, more ambiguous, and far less satisfying than the tidy conclusions their novels promised. The Wallace case proved that sometimes there is no killer to unmask, no final revelation. Sometimes there is only silence and suspicion, lingering across decades. Nearly a century later, the Julia Wallace case stands as a haunting lesson in reasonable doubt. A man was convicted on suspicion alone, freed by appeals courts, yet never exonerated in the court of public opinion. The real killer vanished into history, their identity lost to time. Wallace lived out his days under a cloud of suspicion, innocent, but forever marked. Sometimes justice fails not by convicting the guilty, but by failing to find them at all.